Well, thank you so much, Marion, for that introduction. And can I also thank Dr. Matilda House for that welcome to country, and begin by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. In my case, that's the Kaurna people. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm so sorry that border restrictions prevent me from being there in person today. I was honestly so looking forward to discussing and debating over the next couple of days in person with so many of you leaders in this field. And I'd also just like to begin by particularly sending my thoughts to those of us who are joining in from lockdowns across Australia today. And I just wanted to wish that you will have both good health and freedom as soon as possible. Mainly today though, I actually wanted to say thank you to each and every one of you for recognising the importance of this issue and for making the decision to speak up and work towards change. If there's one lesson that I took away from watching Julia Gillard's experience as Prime Minister up close, it was that we need a chorus of voices. The women in the Parliament cannot and should not be expected to have to stand up and try and fight for change on their own. So I just honestly can't express my gratitude enough to all of you who have put so much work in and who have ensured that we keep this issue on the agenda and that we work towards a better and fairer way forward. Now today I've been asked to give you an introduction into how Parliament as a gendered workplace manifests itself. Well, there's many ways. Gendered abuse on the floor of the Parliament, sexist treatment in the media, and discrimination in the way that women are regarded, and the consequences of all of this. Now, despite the title of my talk today, I do not intend for it to be an advertisement or a summary for my recent book, Sex, Lies and Question Time, though it is available now in all good bookshops. But I will also tell you what it won't be. Over the next 2 days, you're going to be treated to many academic presentations. You're going to learn of really important research. You're going to hear the most insightful analysis, and you will see some truly eye-opening data in many of the presentations that will follow. Now, I am not an academic. In fact, my political opponents used to regularly highlight the fact that I am indeed a university dropout. So instead today, what I'm going to focus on is lived experience and personal anecdotes. I spoke to 16 women who are current or former representatives in the Australian Parliament when I was researching my book. Along with my own experiences of 15 years as an elected federal MP, it painted a very clear view. Every single woman had a story to tell about how they were disrespected and treated differently because they were a woman. Everyone, from right across the political spectrum, from right across the decades. No one could argue that Parliament is not a gendered workplace. Now, of course, these experiences differed greatly from the more minor, perhaps, remarks about physical appearance, about clothing, casual sexism and assumptions, to the most extreme, violent sexualised abuse, rape threats, public humiliation and slut shaming, and all stops in between. In almost every area, women had been treated differently and faced higher hurdles. The decisions that we make about motherhood, our personal relationships, the policy areas that we're given access to, how credible we're regarded as, how difficult the path to promotion is, all of it regularly and systemically. Now, the consequences of this are far-ranging. Consequences on those individual women, on their confidence, on their credibility, their willingness and their effectiveness to stand up and to speak out, on their sense of personal safety, on their ability to focus on the role that they've been elected to play. But it also has consequences on the way that governments operate, what policies are prioritised, what programs are funded, what issues sit at the centre of government agendas, and indeed what people sit at the cabinet table to set this agenda. All of this impacts on our community and the nation as a whole. All of it is wrong, unfair and counterproductive. So it is worth us standing up and demanding change. Now, hindsight is obviously a wonderful thing, but it does sit really heavily with me that my book focused on what I know best, that is the experience of being an elected woman in the Parliament. But of course, what we all know well is that the consequences of extreme power imbalances are felt most acutely by those with the least power, by the most vulnerable. And in this case, that is often junior female staffers. We've seen in recent months just how devastating the consequences of this can be. What we need to also acknowledge is how widespread the impacts of this have likely been. Bullying, abuse, sexual harassment, manipulation, sexual assault, rape. In the place that's meant to lead our nation, it's truly horrifying. The discussions that I've had and the disclosures that I've heard in recent months absolutely make me shudder to think how many more of these cases there are. Now, all of this matters. It matters deeply to those individuals, to their lives, to their careers. It also matters well beyond the walls of Parliament and its inhabitants. And I have to say, the further removed that I am from Parliament, the more convinced I am of how widespread the consequences of our gendered Parliament are. There has been a deep pain felt by Australian women this year, and I don't believe that it's unrelated at all. Sadly, the appallingly high levels of violence against women in Australia are far from new, and they've barely shifted over decades. So many may ask why this reaction now? And I actually believe it is directly related to the recognition of what a gendered workplace our Parliament is. It's really important to understand the impact of high-profile news stories involving Grace Tame speaking out, telling her story of her own sexual assault, but also urging Australian women to speak their truth. Brittany Higgins going public with her shocking allegations of rape and the huge coverage of the allegations of historical rape against Christian Porter. I cannot think of a time that there has ever been more mainstream coverage on women's sexual assaults. And it was hugely triggering for tens of thousands of women who have themselves been victims of sexual assault. It's one thing to look at statistics, and it's something we do all the time. But when you consider the statistic that 1 in 5 women over the age of 15 has experienced sexual assault, what that actually tells us is that across Australia right now, there are over 1 million women who have been subjected to sexual assault. That is a staggering figure. And the truth is that the overwhelming majority of those women have never reported. Many have never even spoken about it until now. But this year we've seen that women across the country were sent back to the terribly traumatic events as they each relived horrific experiences in their own lives simultaneously. And the new thing is that many women have now formed the opinion that no one powerful either understands or cares. I don't think that women came together in their hundreds of thousands just because they cared about Brittany Higgins' case or the accusations against Christian Porter. They rose up because of what those cases told us about our own experiences. That's where a lot of the rage came from. I think that many women, myself included, still find it utterly incomprehensible that an alleged rape could take place inside Parliament House, in a minister's office no less, and that it would not have been brought to the Prime Minister's attention. I just cannot think of any major business where that would not have been taken to the boss. I can't imagine any board of directors that would not expect that information to be brought to their attention. But that's what happened in our federal government, and it sent a message to women across Australia. And that message was that the government didn't care, that they didn't think it was a priority issue. And I think women took that very, very personally. Because if they don't care when it happens in Parliament House, in the ministerial wing, who's going to care when it happens in an alleyway, when it happens in a car, when it happens in a house, when it happens in the streets? If Brittany Higgins felt that she had to choose between her job working for the government or pursuing justice, why would anyone think that justice for them is a priority? And similarly, I actually don't think the thing that hit home about the Christian Porter allegations Was even people necessarily forming a firm view on his guilt or innocence? I think it was the Prime Minister's statement that he didn't read the detailed allegations against Porter, instead saying, I asked him and he said he didn't do it. Well, that's that then, I guess, hey. I think one of the really confronting things for women has been that there's always been a belief that the political system might be one of the best avenues to achieve change. And this year, we've seen just how far it's been found wanting. It's become apparent that the institution that so many rely upon to tackle this epidemic of gendered violence across Australia, the institution itself is infected by a culture of disrespect for women and a frat house boys club dynamic. Now, the reason why this really matters is that it's bad for the women who face those injustices, but it's also terrible if our broader society loses faith in our democracy. That's not a side issue, that is potentially devastating. We cannot have half the population feel that our parliament doesn't represent them, their lives and their experiences. But now is our chance for change, and we absolutely have to grasp it with both hands. I was really pleased to participate and be interviewed by Kate Jenkins and the independent review into the workplaces of parliamentarians and their staff. I outlined my views on just how pervasive I think the problem is, but also that I think that there are 3 levels which need to be addressed if we are to truly progress. The first and most challenging set of issues are the structural ones. It's incredibly difficult to navigate real change without a zero tolerance attitude and serious consequences for inappropriate conduct. It's also seriously challenging to introduce this with the power imbalances that are entrenched in our system. The truth is that when you're elected by some 100,000 members of your community and the general public, it leads to an enormous sense of entitlement, and it's also hard for anyone to truly discipline you, whether that be the parliament or indeed your own political party. When there are close parliamentary votes, when there are must-win marginal seats, when there are threats of bringing down governments if one vote is to not turn up, then there is enormous power, almost an untouchable invincibility that is given to many elected MPs. So short of turning our democracy on its head, rewriting our electoral system and indeed our constitution, then many of these systemic structural issues provide not insignificant hurdles to change. The second layer of issues which I believe need to be tackled are the cultural issues. This can be tricky, but it is easier to progress. I am 100% convinced that the culture of Parliament House lags hopelessly behind that of modern Australia. There are many reasons for this, but we also know that culture can change. Often we think that this takes a long time, and it can. But I also saw firsthand how quickly the culture within my party changed in tandem with the increase in women that were elected within our ranks. Changing the culture in the building is critical. And to me, there is a very simple question of whether political leaders are actually genuine about wanting to see change, and that is whether they will support solid mechanisms to introduce equal gender representation within their party. Without that, I'm afraid all of the rest of it is just talk. Now, the third level of issues, in my view, are at a procedural level. This is hardly difficult, but it has been largely completely lacking. Policies on training, policies on support, effective complaints mechanisms, parliamentary conventions, and dare I say it, perhaps even consequences. All seemingly pretty easy to fix, but all currently largely ineffective or indeed completely non-existent. We can fix this, and our work here today and tomorrow can play an important role in forming the answers to these issues. The discussions and deliberations that we engage in over the next 2 days have the potential to offer solutions at all 3 of the levels which I've just outlined. I believe that reform is absolutely within our grasp. The momentum is there, and now is the time that we need to be the people who will stand up and keep fighting until we get the change that the nation needs. So I'm so grateful for all of the work and commitment so many of you have contributed to tackling these issues. I'm so grateful that you're giving your time and your brain power to helping come up with the solutions. And I'm actually really excited about the tangible prospect of real change. So today, tomorrow, let's make it happen. I'm really grateful to be here with you today, and I look forward to now engaging in discussion and answering any questions that you might have, and let the brainstorming begin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, for that brilliant speech. And this is the book, by the way, Sex, Lies and Question Time, and it's fantastic and depressing, but important conversation that we need to be having around gender in politics. So we have a bit of time for a Q&A session right now. I think I can answer questions from both online and in person. So do you have any questions to start off with for Kate about this? Yeah, Chris?
Hi, Kate, Chris Wallace. I was very impressed with today's Parliament your presentation. Could you expand before on scope to see or influencing the change of parliamentary conventions in a way that would make a difference?
Did you get that, or should I repeat?
Sorry, can you repeat, Blair? I can't hear the question.
In a summary, what was that, Chris? Sorry. So how can parliamentary conventions be used to change things, essentially, in politics?
Well, I think that, thank you, Chris, for the question. The truth is that Parliament sets standards and has a set of conventions which are already in place. There is, for example, a convention in place that there are certain things that are off limits in question time. Now, at the moment, that stands as people's staff are generally regarded as off limits, and people's families are generally regarded as off limits. I think that we could probably strengthen those conventions. For example, maybe we could make it that people's sex lives were off limits to be shouted about across the chamber, or, that we wouldn't set up royal commissions into female prime ministers' boyfriends from 20 years previously. I think that sometimes we think that we don't have the capacity to lift the standards. It would require an agreement across the Parliament that they thought there was a problem and they wanted it to be lifted. But I honestly think, particularly in the way that Parliament runs, in the way that question time runs, it is this really entrenched masculine sense of aggressiveness in the Parliament. And I think that turns the Australian public away. But I also think that it treats women in the Parliament harsher than it does men. So I think that's one example of where the parties could get together and they could say, let's broaden what's off limits and let's lift the standards.
Brilliant, thank you. And we have one online question. So Kate, they say, I think we continue to think in responses mode, and what we need is a primary prevention approach alongside response. Your thoughts?
I think that when it comes to violence against women and women's issues in the community, we know the answers. We know that primary prevention is absolutely significant. We've had a case down here in Adelaide. I've been doing a bit of work with some high school students from Adelaide High, who you might have seen did a walk-off because of the treatment that they were receiving when they're at school. And, the question that I just put to them is, why does anyone think that if boys are being allowed to get away with disrespecting girls when they're in high school, that they're not going to grow up into men who are going to disrespect women? And primary prevention is the key across the nation. But that's also related to the Parliament. You need to have a Parliament that accepts that this is a priority issue and that is willing to tackle and have hard conversations, even with children, not ridiculous ads about milkshakes. So I think if the Parliament wasn't such a gendered workplace, if the Parliament truly recognised the critical importance of primary prevention and thought that this was a priority issue, then we would be seeing some real programs rolled out.
Brilliant. Any other questions from the audience? Caitlin?
The merit argument that women are there. Anytime a woman gets put forward, it's you don't have like merit is to play.
So Caitlin said, how do we get around the idea of the merit argument when it comes to pre-selection processes and I guess every process in that?
I just think that, I think even the people using it know what rubbish that is now. Like, seriously, let's have a look at the Parliament. Let's have a look at the scandals we've seen in the last 2 years. And anyone try and argue that those people are there on merit. I think we just call it out for the rubbish it is. And do you know, the thing is that, yeah, if you have quotas in place, if you have targets, affirmative action policies, there's a risk that as a woman, if you're elected, someone's going to call you the quota girl. I experienced that myself. But do you know what? If they're not calling you the quota girl, they're likely calling you the bimbo. They're suggesting you slept your way into Parliament. There's always a criticism. So I think we just accept that that might come. And if it doesn't, something else will, but it's worth it. And it changes the culture and it changes the understanding within the Parliament. I just think the time has passed for the argument about quotas and merit. The time is here for action. And if the government doesn't see that, then I really believe that it is all talk and all of the efforts of Kate Jenkins and others will be wasted, because that is the simplest and easiest way to bring about change.
Thanks, Kate. We have one from online from Angelica Hurick saying, thank you for your presentation. What cultural changes do you see are needed, not only in Parliament, but more so in the broader community, media, etc., that supports this imbalance to bring about equality, and how can we bring about the needed changes?
Well, there's a few things. One, I think it comes down to respect. It comes down to respect for women. And, there is this vicious cycle where we see appalling behaviour within the Parliament, when we see the media either failing to call it out or indeed adding to that level of sexism. And then we wonder why it comes from the community as well. We need to break this nexus. And I argue that members of Parliament should be better, but the media needs to be better too. And I think that there has been some progress in actually recognising that the sort of treatment that Julia Gillard was receiving from the media, I'm not sure whether it would get away with it as much today. Maybe I'm an optimist. I've been accused of worse. So I think it's about everybody lifting the standards. It's got to be about consequences when there's not. But the other thing, when it comes to respect for women, that I just can't quite get my head around. Earlier this year, we had that horrific week where we had 3 horrible cases of domestic violence related deaths within the space of a few days. In Gold Coast, woman burnt in her backyard. I think it was the following day, a baby in my state of South Australia strapped to her father and thrown nearly 40 metres off the Whispering Wall. And then just a couple of days later, finding the decomposed body of a woman who'd been killed by her carer. And I looked at that and obviously was horrified. And then I heard the announcement that Scott Morrison was calling a national cabinet about a national emergency. And I thought, finally, we're going to stand up and treat this like the emergency it was. It is. That national cabinet was about the vaccine rollout, which clearly is also a national emergency. But I just don't see how we get change when it comes to respect for women if we don't regard the disrespect and the violence against women as a number one national priority and regard it as an emergency. I cannot fathom how that hasn't already happened.
Thanks, Kate. And just one more from the audience, Jane?
Thank you very much. You spoke about the importance of others telling their story to snowball others to speak out. I'm wondering what pressure you got to not publish.
I think I heard that about pressures not to speak out, or if some speak out, it's easier for others. To be honest with you, I mean, I know this sounds staggering to normal people who work in normal environments, but I honestly, when I was in the Parliament, it just didn't strike me how out of touch and behind modern Australia the culture of Parliament was. It really didn't, because I'd basically grown up there because you know, I expect that the culture in Parliament was the culture that existed largely across Australia a couple of decades ago, but I think the rest of the nation changed and Parliament stayed the same. So I did feel nervous about speaking up, not because I worried that I would be criticised, but I actually found the hardest thing about writing my book was this constant balancing act between wanting things to be better and recognising that they needed to be called out if they were going to change, and at the same time really desperately wanting more women to go into Parliament and not wanting to turn them off. And I found that a really hard juggling act to do, because the last thing I'd want to do is turn more women off going into Parliament when I think that's what we need and that's what the solution is. So there wasn't a pressure from others not to speak out, but I found that myself. But I do think we've seen a snowball effect. You know, we've seen after this culture of silence for a long time, we've seen a whole lot of different stories at a whole lot of different levels come out. And I think that's a very good thing because it all builds on the momentum for change.
Brilliant. And we have to wrap that one up because of time. Thank you so much, Kate Ellis, for a fantastic and powerful speech. And, you know, it's great to see your book again be published, you know, in this year of all years.